Hello and welcome to lecture number 15. This is topic 2.4, African resistance on slave ships and the anti-slavery movement. The first learning objective is to describe the methods by which Africans resisted their commodification and enslavement, individually and collectively during the Middle Passage. The experience on slave ships, as we've discussed earlier, was grim. There were unsanitary and crowded conditions, and there was also a lot of cruelty from the slave ship captains and crew. The trauma of deracination, which means forced displacement, the commodification, which means being turned into objects, and the lifelong enslavement that was about to follow were compelling reasons for the resistance that occurred on slave ships. Most resistance happened before the slave ship had sailed off the coast of Africa because the chance of returning home seemed more likely. They were still near the African coast, not in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or thousands of miles away on a different continent. However, their chances of escape while still on the African coast were still unlikely because the people nearest the coast were part of the kingdoms that had enslaved them. Enslaved people would have been easily recognizable and turned over for a profit or resold to be put into a different slave ship. The individual and collective methods of resistance on slave ships were quite incredible. They had to overcome linguistic differences to form revolts. Slave ship captains who bought enslaved people from the barracoons or holding cells of the coast would often buy enslaved people from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds to prevent revolts on the ship. Women and children who sometimes had freer movement across the ship often played crucial roles in revolts by providing tools or weapons to the men to free their chains and attack the crew. One instance of such a revolt is the Little George in 1730, in which the enslaved successfully freed their chains, seized control of the ship, and navigated back towards Africa. When they reached the coast of Sierra Leone, the surviving captives and crew abandoned the ship. Another major instance of a rebellion on board of a slave ship is the New Britannia in 1773. While still off the African coast, the enslaved people on board managed to get a hold of a barrel of black powder and lit it on fire in an act of mass suicide. The act killed most of the crew and enslaved people on board, showing that they would rather die than willingly go into a life of enslavement. Individual acts of resistance also included hunger strikes. Enslaved people were already receiving very scant portions of food daily, but refusing to eat was a way for them to regain some form of agency and control over their lives. The same goes for those who tried to jump overboard. In a future slide, we'll discuss some of the consequences for hunger strikers and the measures taken by slave ships to prevent more people from jumping overboard. The resistance on board made the slave trade more expensive and dangerous. To reduce the risk of resistance, slave ship captains had to increase the number of crew members to maintain control over the people on board, cutting into their profits. To offset this, captains would then transport even more people to maintain high profits. Revolts could also cause delays in the journey to North America and use up more provisions than planned. Because of the resistance, slave ships captains justified harsher treatment. For those on hunger strikes, they used a metal tool called the speculum oris to force feed them. Whenever a revolt was quelled, those who participated would be punished. Depending on the perceived value of those who revolted, punishments varied. Those deemed highly valuable due to their physical appearance and labor potential might receive more lenient punishment than others. Women and children often faced harsher punishments, sometimes including death, because of their lack of perceived value. Resistance or attempts to jump overboard also led to changes in the design of slave ships. Nets were constructed to prevent suicides, and barricades were built to separate sleeping quarters and the deck. Enslaved people were brought onto the deck at least once a day for exercise, a time when insurrections were most likely. To prevent this, a barricaded area was created when enslaved people could exercise while the crew continued their duties on the other side. The crew also used guns to prevent any insurrections. One of the most famous cases of an insurrection on a slave ship is that of the Amistad. This successful revolt occurred in 1839 off the Cuban coast. It was led by a Mende captive from Sierra Leone named Sengbe Pie, also known as Joseph Cinque. The enslaved people killed the captain and forced the remaining crew to sail towards the United States. They were intercepted by a U.S. government ship responsible for collecting import duties. Once intercepted, the captives were arrested and went to trial to gain their freedom. The trial lasted 2 years, and ultimately, the Supreme Court granted their freedom. 35 survivors were able to return to Africa. The trial generated public sympathy for abolition, and former President John Quincy Adams argued before the court on behalf of the enslaved people. The Amistad case was as significant as it highlighted the ongoing illegal trade of enslaved Africans even after the international slave trade was banned. The second learning objective is to describe the features of slave ship diagrams created during the era of the slave trade. An example of a slave ship diagram is on the screen. These diagrams depict the systematic arrangement of captives. Often, slave ships were older vessels that were repurposed to transport human cargo. They would be retrofitted with various levels of sleeping quarters in the cargo hold, and barricades would be erected with nets placed on the sides of the ship to prevent people from jumping overboard. The average number of journeys for a slave ship back and forth across the Atlantic was no more than 12. By the 1750s, purpose-built ships were being constructed in cities like Liverpool, designed to maximize the profit by transporting as many people as possible, though these were usually more expensive. The Brooks was a famous example, initially built to carry 454 slaves, but often packed with over 600. Due to the reduced space in the cargo holds, captives had anywhere between 20 and 30 inches of headroom. The total cargo hold was about 5 feet tall, separated into 2 levels, making the conditions extremely cramped. The diagrams often showed fewer enslaved people than actually traveled on many of the voyages. In 1787, the British passed a law that limited the ratio of humans to ship tonnage to 1.67, meaning a 100-ton ship could not transport more than 167 humans. For ships over 200 tons, the ratio had to be 1-to-1. Despite these regulations, the actual numbers of enslaved people often exceeded that allowable limit by law. The diagrams depicted the cramped and unsanitary conditions, which increased the incidence of disease, disability, and death. Captives had to sleep on bare wooden planks inside the cargo hold, and the constant rocking of the ship caused sores and chafing. The bathroom facilities were open buckets, making diseases like dysentery easily transmissible. In one documented case, a ship from Liverpool in 1781 had a 40% mortality rate due to the disease outbreaks. Slave ship diagrams rarely included features used to minimize resistance, such as guns, nets, or iron instruments like the speculum oris for force feeding. These conditions had to be endured for an average of 60 days and sometimes as long as 90 days. The last learning objective is to explain how African resistance on slave ships and slave ship diagrams inspired abolitionists and black artists during the era of slavery and after. Slave ship diagrams were used by abolitionists to end the slave trade and later slavery itself. They successfully lobbied for laws limiting the number of captives per ship. The British law in 1787 was a direct result of anti-slavery advocacy, using slave ship diagrams to highlight the inhumane condition captives endured. By 1807 and 1808, Britain and the United States respectively ended the international slave trade. This was influenced by the activism of abolitionists who used diagrams of the Brooks to illustrate the cruelty of the trade. Black and white anti-slavery activists circulated these diagrams, with the most famous being the Brooks, constructed in Liverpool. The diagrams show the cruelty of the cramped conditions and raised awareness of the dehumanizing conditions endured during the Middle Passage. The image of the Brooks became iconic in anti-slavery campaigns, appearing in pamphlets, posters, and books to garner public support of abolition. And despite how tightly cramped the diagrams make it look inside of the Brooks, the allowable limit of human cargo that the ship could transport was actually higher than the diagram could show. Since abolition, black artists have repurposed the iconography of the slave ship to process historical trauma and honor their ancestors' memory. They have transformed the image from one of suffering to one of resilience and strength, as their ancestors endured the conditions and continued their lineage in the Americas. Contemporary artists like Kara Walker and Romario Bearden have incorporated slave ship imagery into their works to highlight the enduring legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. To recap, enslaved people resisted the inhumane and unsanitary treatment during the Middle Passage. Slave ships were outfitted with nets and barricades to deal with resistance. Slave ship diagrams circulated during the 18th and 19th centuries depicted the systematic arrangement of captives. Conditions on ships increased the incidence of disease, disability, and death. Resistance and conditions on slave ships inspired anti-slavery activism, and black artists have repurposed the iconography of the slave ship to process historical trauma. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.